So the title of my dissertation is Knowledge to Action in the Anthropocene, Understanding and Managing Biogeochemical Cycles Under Anthropogenic Global Change. And my dissertation is organized in 3 parts, each comprising 2 chapters. And so in the first part, I use biophysical scientific methods to look at feedbacks within the carbon cycle, understanding how the carbon cycle will respond to different forms of anthropogenic influence. In the second part, I use social scientific methods to look at coastal ecosystem services management in a variety of contexts. And in the third, I took a deep dive, not into the Arctic with Kevin's research group, but right in our backyard in San Francisco Bay to look at some of the problems related to human impacts on the nitrogen cycle. And as much as I would love to keep you here for another 2.5 hours and talk to you about all of this, today I'm actually going to tell just a few of these stories from 3 of my chapters. So I'm going to start with a little introduction and motivation for how I frame all of the research that I've done in my dissertation, and then walk you through 3 different stories. One about coastal carbon in conservation practice, one about coastal carbon in policy practice, and then one about nitrogen at the science policy interface. So let's start with the introduction and motivation. First, I want you all to take a really deep breath. Now breathe out. What gas did you breathe out? Anybody? Nitrogen, okay. Carbon dioxide, some of you did. In fact, we have monitors on a lot of these rooms. Did you pollute the atmosphere when you breathed CO2 out? Did you contribute to anthropogenic climate change? I hear some no's. I see a few nods in the back. Okay. I'm combusting a very small amount of butane here. Hey. Am I polluting the atmosphere? Yes, I see a lot of nods. Right, and so in the first case, when we breathe out carbon dioxide, we're breathing out carbon that was oxidized by respiration in our bodies. And where did that carbon come from? It came from photosynthesis into a plant, or maybe up the food chain into an animal, if that's your persuasion. But in the case of the lighter, I'm combusting a hydrocarbon that was not recently in the atmosphere. And so even though these chemical reactions are almost identical, combustion and respiration, it's the oxidation of a hydrocarbon, in one case I'm adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and in another case I'm not. But wait a minute, I thought that deforestation was a major cause of global climate change, the emissions from deforestation, and I just said, you know, CO2 is recently in the atmosphere and it goes back, that's not pollution. So why do we consider deforestation to be a source of anthropogenic emissions? Well, the reason is that the carbon stays in the forest, in the bodies of trees and in the soils for a pretty long time. But how long is long enough, right? What's the difference between a forest and your lawn out back? Well, we've come up with a metric, about 100 years, right? And this is used in policies, that carbon has to be out of the atmosphere for about 100 years to count as sequestration. So I have a question for you. Has anyone in this room ever met a 100-year-old cow? We consider livestock emissions to be anthropogenic emissions, a major source of greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. This is why you hear a lot of things about vegetarianism being really important for saving the planet. Why do we consider these emissions to be anthropogenic? Well, the reason is that there are far, far more cows on this planet than there would be without human beings. So this is wild elephants and millions of tons of animal, a really convenient unit. This is humans, and this is cows, right? So in seeking to define what constitutes anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, it's something which increases the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases and which would not have occurred but for human activities, right? And so already here you can see this technical, this scientific question, you know, let's just define what anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are, has an element in which we have to develop rules, metrics, norms, that people have to make a decision about what assumptions we should be using here. And so in framing my dissertation work, which is all about the biogeochemical problems of the Anthropocene, the excess amount of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere causing global climate change and ocean acidification in the oceans, the excess amount of fixed nitrogen that comes from agricultural activities, wastewater, many other human activities, which has significant negative effects on water quality, from eutrophication to dead zones to even affecting drinking water. In understanding how our society responds to these problems, I'm really interested in the connection between our scientific understanding of these cycles and what our management, law, and policy institutions are doing about it. And this is not just a theoretical question. This is happening right now, all over the place. We are writing these rules right now, from California's cap and trade program to arguments about whether biomass is carbon neutral, to corporate greenhouse gas accounting and different scopes, to the development of nutrient trading or numeric water quality criteria. When we're dealing with the problems of the biogeochemical problems of the Anthropocene right now, we're crafting a whole lot of rules. And so this is the space that interests me, right? How we make these decisions. This is where the ecological understanding meets the social and political understanding, and this is where I combine my understanding of global change ecology and environmental governance. And so I want to offer you a theoretical framework that I'm going to use throughout the rest of my talk when I tell the 3 stories of my chapters. And this is the theoretical framework of social ecological systems. So this was developed by Elinor Ostrom and many people who have come after her as a way to kind of categorize and understand these arenas, these situations in which scientific information and our understanding of ecological systems is encountering both stakeholders and governance systems. So in this framework, there are 4 components: resource units, resource systems, governance systems, and actors. And you can think of actors as stakeholders, people who participate in or have some stake in the management of a particular resource or ecosystem situation. And those actors, of course, are operating under rules set by our governance systems. Now, the resource units is kind of a tricky thing, and this is where I'm gonna present what my contribution to this literature is. This entire framework was originally developed around the management of common pool resources. Think forests or fisheries, right? And so here, if the resource unit is timber, the resource system is the forest and the ecosystem of the forest. We have the Forest Service up here, and we have loggers and other people who use the forest and recreate down here. And that's where we gained our empirical understanding of what makes environmental management institutions last and endure. But what I'm talking about in my dissertation is not the management of common pool resources. And increasingly, this exact framework is being expanded to cover public goods and other things. And what I'm talking about is the management of ecosystem services, right? So carbon sequestration in ecosystems, denitrification in nitrogen cycle processes, these are forms of ecosystem services. And the challenge is, how well does our empirical understanding derived from all of these cases of common pool resource management, think forests and fisheries, actually apply to all of these new institutions, all those ones I told you about that we're creating right now, cap and trade programs, nutrient trading criteria, understanding and categorizing our human impacts on the carbon and nitrogen cycle. Now, this isn't just a sort of fun theoretical frame that the scholarly literature can get into. It is that, and I want to participate in that. But in the United States last fall, the White House issued a memo directing all federal agencies to incorporate the values of ecosystem services into all of their decision-making. So it's really important for us to understand how the management of ecosystem services works in practice on the ground right now. Because this is happening and it's coming. And if we don't understand what the best practices are, we're going to start creating ad hoc institutions that may end up failing. Right? And so that's the motivation of my research on the applied side, right? The side where I'm trying to make a difference in what's happening now as a sustainability scientist, engaging with questions that are directly in front of governance institutions right now. So now I'm going to jump into each of the 3 stories. And in each of these stories, you're going to see that framework return. And I'll tell you how and in what component of that theoretical framework I'm asking a question. So first, let's talk about coastal carbon in conservation practice. So the title of this chapter is Barriers to Incorporating Climate Change Mitigation, Ecosystem Services into Coastal Conservation Practice, the Case of Blue Carbon. What does that mean? Well, what is blue carbon? Blue carbon is the carbon that is sequestered and ultimately stored in coastal ecosystems. Think seagrass meadows, mangroves, tidal flats, and salt marshes. And these ecosystems every year sequester hundreds of millions of tons of carbon globally. That's about the same order of magnitude as the emissions from the economy of the state of California, just to give you a perspective on the total amount. And there are not a lot of these ecosystems, but per unit area, they're among the strongest carbon sinks on the planet. And so if we return to our theoretical framework, what I've done in this chapter is to try to understand the relationship between our knowledge of carbon sequestration and actors. And in this case, the stakeholders, rather than fishermen or loggers, are coastal conservation organizations, organizations that are place-based and have an ability to steward or make decisions about managing their ecosystems. They're often interested in restoration. They're primed to try to enhance these carbon stocks, to enhance these ecosystem services. And this is all taking place, again, going back to what I said earlier, in the context of the use of ecosystem services in decision-making. So basically, my question here is, on the ground, how are the organizations that are actually making decisions about managing coastal ecosystems using or incorporating the ecosystem services framework, or talking about blue carbon, if at all? So my research questions are, under what conditions do place-based coastal conservation organizations incorporate carbon sequestration ecosystem services into their work, and what barriers exist to such incorporation? So I'm going to walk you through the methodological approach that I used, which was based on semi-structured interviews, ultimately with almost 35 directors of these coastal conservation organizations. So first, I wanted to identify my study space. And here, I made a conscious decision to choose locations where I expected there to be at least some of these organizations that were using this new framework, right? I wanted to make sure that was in my sampling plan, so I focused on California and the Gulf of Maine ecoregions, both places where there's a robust history of both coastal conservation organizations being really active, as well as climate mitigation policies. I then identified and contacted organizations that fit a specific set of criteria. They had to be place-based organizations that were operating at a local scale. I was really interested in how this framework that's coming from the federal government is being used by these organizations that are working on the ground. So think Friends of the Bay, Friends of a Small Marsh, and I went estuary by estuary in each one of these ecoregions, and I identified the full set of all possible organizations that were working on these issues. So these are not big multinational NGOs that I'm interviewing. I conducted my interviews and coded them, and what I used was a modified grounded theory method, which is sort of an iterative form of categorization, to develop a typology of the barriers and sets of conditions under which these organizations are taking action on this idea of blue carbon. Right? And so what I'm going to do now is walk you through the results from this and show you the 5 different barriers, kinds of barriers that I identified, and give you example quotations from the data in my interviews to illustrate what I mean by this. So the first 3 kinds of barriers are well documented in the literature for the uptake of new ideas. These are reasons why these organizations are not going to take action. The first are technical, right? It's actually quite complex to measure gas fluxes, as I know from from the work in one of the chapters I'm not talking to you about today. And so here's what one science director said. We decided to do a study, but we didn't have any intention of looking at the gas fluxes. I mean, I was like, are you kidding me with this stuff? So maybe the complexity of the gas fluxes are, along the lines of why no one's really trying to do blue carbon. The next is resources, time and money. No one has enough time or enough money, and this is widely documented in the literature. We're barely able to do what we've already got going on, so we haven't really thought about it. We haven't had time to think about it, to be honest. And the last is, because we're talking about carbon sequestration ecosystem services, there's an element in the United States of the politics of climate change. And there were several respondents who told me directly that they didn't want to deal with this particular issue simply because it had to do with carbon and therefore climate. In other words, I wouldn't touch carbon with a 10-foot pole. Now, the 2 next types of barriers that I identified I think are really interesting in the literature, and I think they're one of the really important lessons of this research for informing future decision-making around how to incorporate ecosystem services into decision-making. And the first is that many respondents told me that there were other motivations, and the particular people working for these organizations were not interested in learning new things. They were naturalists. They were birders, right? These are salt marshes. People go there. They engage in a lot of birding. We've got a lot of retired people, so part of what happens is you get people entrenched. They've learned to be naturalists, and they're going to teach it, and you don't get the new information finding its way in. That's part of what limits the scope of what we do in response to why they were not working on blue carbon. And the last, I think, is particularly interesting because it speaks to a result about scale. That the ecosystem services that we're talking about here, carbon sequestration, are delivered at a globally diffuse scale. Everyone benefits this small marginal amount by the carbon that you're taking out of the atmosphere when you're restoring a salt marsh. And as one respondent told me, I see carbon management as being out of my league. As a little guy working on the ground, thinking about the carbon stored in these trees as opposed to their cachet, their cooling effect, it's just a decision being made at a different scale. In other words, the motivating reason why they were engaged in conservation had to do with that place. And the entire discussion around carbon ecosystem services was far bigger than that place and conserving that place. Now, there were plenty of organizations that were engaging in work on blue carbon and incorporating into their work. And they all had two conditions in common, 100% of them, right? So if we're doing a truth table approach, this is a necessary condition. Some connection with a research laboratory of some kind, whether university or otherwise, and some connection or knowledge of the work of a particular nationwide NGO called Restore America's Estuaries that's been really advocating work on blue carbon. One of the most interesting results from this work actually has to do with a transition that took place in several organizations when they first started considering whether or not to engage in work on blue carbon in their work. And that's what I call the pivot to water quality. So this is a septic system. And it goes something like this. An organization has an initial interest in coastal ecosystem carbon values in order to try to get some dollars for marsh restoration, which is part of what they're interested in. So they conduct some initial research on ecosystem net greenhouse gas budgets. They recognize that the relative amount of dollars for restoration is likely pretty small, even though per unit area it's high, they're not going to get that much. And one of the guys I talked to said they would get about 1/6 of what they need to actually fund the project from the current value of carbon. Coupled with a lack of clear future for the carbon market, direct payment for ecosystem services was no longer pursued. But in doing the greenhouse gas budget, they recognized that local nitrogen pollution, mostly from septic systems, increases nitrous oxide emission from the marshes, right? And therefore, they had a new argument to engage with local water quality managers in activities using the greenhouse gas reduction from end pollution as an incentive to engage. In other words, there's a transition here that's taking place that's re-articulating the problem they're trying to address from this globally diffuse problem of climate mitigation to one they actually have some familiarity and connections with dealing with local water quality problems. So the conclusions from this work are that there is some amount of place-based resistance to embracing the ecosystem services framework that's delivered at globally diffuse scales. I saw several instances of a re-articulation of climate mitigation to water quality that helped to localize this issue. And I think this is really important evidence and advice as the federal government and all the agencies within it are currently undergoing a process of contemplating how to respond to the directive to provide guidance on how to consider ecosystem services, which is that there's no bottom-up push for this from the exact kinds of organizations that are in a position to embrace and work with that. So any kind of guidance needs to recognize the conditions on the ground of these local and small-scale organizations. So I'm going to transition now to talking about my next story, my next chapter. And we're going to stick with blue carbon. Okay, everybody with me? The carbon stored in coastal ecosystems. But now we're going to talk about an informal policy practice in a formal governance context, not the context of these nonprofit coastal conservation organizations. So the next chapter is titled Carbon of Convenience, the Consideration of Blue Carbon under the National Environmental Policy Act. And I'll tell you in a minute what the National Environmental Policy Act is and why it's relevant here. But going back to our theoretical framework here, we're really directly looking at how this resource, these ecosystem services, the carbon sequestered in coastal ecosystems, is being treated under a very specific governance system in reference to policies that might be in place to help promote carbon sequestration. So the entire idea behind blue carbon is really driven by an idea to restore coastal ecosystems in order to get money from carbon credits to restore coastal ecosystems. We've lost in California about 90 to 95% of our historical coastal wetlands. And while we're not going to restore all of that, because we're not just going to get rid of Redwood City, this was the initial motivation for a lot of the interest in blue carbon work. But it's kind of stalled out. There's not actually a compliance grade market for blue carbon credits. And while there is a voluntary protocol, it hasn't gotten much use yet. But what I'm interested in here in this chapter is how are these exact same ecosystem services, this carbon sequestration in coastal ecosystems, how is it being incorporated under the National Environmental Policy Act? So the National Environmental Policy Act is a statute that we have that has a procedural rather than a substantive requirement. Anytime a federal agency engages in any kind of action that potentially has a significant effect on the environment, they have to prepare an initial environmental assessment, and then if it's found from that initial environmental assessment that there is likely to be a significant impact on the environment from the action that they're going to permit, they have to prepare a full environmental impact statement. And so the research questions I'm looking at here are, well, how is blue carbon talked about within these environmental impact statements? What are the conditions under which impacts on blue carbon are included within environmental impact statements? And when blue carbon is included, how is it included? And so right now, there's no formal required guidance. There's no formal required guidance on how to treat blue carbon or any kind of carbon sequestration ecosystem services within environmental impact statements. What there has been are 2 rounds of draft guidance from the Council on Environmental Quality, which is in the White House, that provides this guidance, right? So this is what I call a flexible policy space. It's kind of an interesting circumstance right now where people know there's attention to it, and we currently do see some consideration of carbon cycle ecosystem services within environmental impact statements, but there's not a strict formula that everyone needs to follow every time, right? And this is a perfect case for understanding first mover path dependent effects, right? We need to understand right now how people are treating and thinking about carbon sequestration within environmental impact statements in order to inform the ongoing development of this guidance. So this is the question I went in with, was what's the status quo treatment of ecosystem carbon storage in coastal ecosystems within environmental impact statements? And I did that by taking advantage of the handy-dandy database that the EPA maintains of all environmental impact statements. So what I looked at was 2012 to 2015. In October 2012, they started actually having the PDFs of every single environmental impact statement. And during that 3-year period, that 3-year window, there were 1,042 total environmental impact statements within this database. But of course, I'm interested in the ones that are focused on blue carbon, that are talking about coastal ecosystem carbon storage. So I had to figure out a way to just isolate the coastal ones. So first I said only those environmental impact statements within coastal states, and then only those that are within the coastal zones of coastal states. But of course, some states very conveniently have the entire state as being the defined coastal zone in relation to the Coastal Zone Management Act. So then I put a 1 kilometer cutoff away from the head of tide. So that left me with 220 coastal environmental impact statements. And broken down by agency, you see here. The biggest one is the Army Corps of Engineers, and on down the line. And then I broke up the environmental impact statements into 9 different project types. The majority were energy projects and construction projects and land and conservation management plans. So environmental impact statements are drafted for all kinds of different activities, anything from dredging, right, to let's come up with a species management plan for a particular endangered species that lives in the coastal zone. But I'm going to come back to some of these project types in a little bit because they're relevant to some of the results from the hypotheses I put forward. Now, one thing that's interesting before I talk to you about the hypotheses and the results is actually comparing blue carbon to forest carbon, right? So many people think about forests as being this stock of carbon as carbon sinks, right? And so what I did is I took a random sample of all of the US Forest Service environmental impact statements, stratified random sample from the exact same time period, and I looked at whether carbon sequestration was considered in any way within environmental impact statements in the coastal zone compared with forests. And it turns out that 43% of Forest Service EISs talk about carbon sequestration in forests, whereas only 17% of coastal ones talk about carbon sequestration in coastal ecosystems. So blue carbon's kind of following in the coattails of forests as we build this governance system. So here are the hypotheses I went in with. Blue carbon is included as a function of the type of project involved, the lead agency that's in charge, the kind of ecosystem that it is, whether it's a salt marsh or mangrove or seagrass meadow, and potentially related to other climate mitigation policies that exist in those jurisdictions. In other words, perhaps there's more consideration of blue carbon in states which already have their own climate mitigation policies and requirements. So I'll walk through the results of each of these 4 hypotheses next. First, and the way I'm approaching some of these questions is to look at expected values and compared using a Pearson's chi-square test. So first, lo and behold, not all that surprising, restoration and conservation projects overperformed in their consideration of blue carbon. It's not entirely surprising, right? This is a flexible policy space, right? It's a place where if you're drafting an environmental impact statement, you don't actually have to consider this ecosystem service. And the ones where you are potentially actually restoring or enhancing that carbon sequestration in the ecosystem actually talk about that ecosystem service far more than the ones that might be removing or destroying or releasing greenhouse gases. Right? And this is not surprising, but it's interesting to see it demarcated here. Secondly, there's a big difference between agencies, and this follows directly from the difference between the project types. Right? The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is far more likely to be in charge of a conservation or restoration project, and therefore has much higher rates of considering carbon sequestration within their environmental impact statements. This is about average performance, and this is below average performance if you look at the total set. Third, it's really salt marshes that we're talking about here, right? So blue carbon is stored in all of these different kinds of coastal ecosystems that I talked about, but 86% of the time, if there was any mention or discussion of blue carbon, it was that salt marshes sequestered carbon, not mangroves or seagrass meadows. And there are plenty of mentions of those and discussions of impacts on the biological communities within them without discussing the carbon cycle situation. Next, this is just for your information. This is a plot of a map of all of the environmental impact statements and their distribution within the coastal zone from this period. And it turns out that the hypothesis that location might really matter turned out to be true, or at least less than 0.05. So 36% of all coastal environmental impact statements were located on the West Coast and in the Northeast. But 80% of the ones that actually talked about carbon sequestration were located in these two regions. In other words, there's a really, really strong effect of the local requirements within these jurisdictions for consideration of climate mitigation policies, including in little NEPAs in Washington State and California. So if you remember, the second question was how is it being considered, right? Not just what are the conditions under which drives the consideration of this ecosystem service. So if coastal carbon sequestration was quantified, it was almost always quantified under an air quality impact section. And this actually differs strongly with forests, which always considered them separately as its own impact. And 87% of the time, any discussion of coastal carbon sequestration was as a form of mitigation for other project greenhouse gas emissions. And so what do I mean by that? I'm going to give you an example quotation from an environmental impact statement in Oregon. So the Hall Slough alternative would also allow for gains in additional climate mitigation benefits through carbon sequestration. For this alternative, where 90 acres of wetland would be restored, this suggests that as much as 88 tons of carbon could be sequestered per year in the restored marsh area. Over the long term, carbon sequestration from the project could be expected to offset CO2 produced during construction. And it's this last line that I'm really interested in here, which is that even within this single document, this single sort of public environmental impact statement, when we have this ecosystem service, we're considering it simply as a way to mitigate other negative effects, greenhouse gas emissions, from within that project, right? We have offsets. In California, we have carbon offsets under our cap and trade system, and these are formalized ways to use ecosystem carbon storage to offset emissions. But here what we're seeing is that the conceptualization of ecosystem carbon is that it's there whenever you need it. It's there if you want to just mitigate some of the construction emissions, and if that's not your concern or you're not actually enhancing this carbon sink, you don't need to worry about it. And I think we see this sort of mentality increasing in the discussion of and the construction of these new approaches to including the carbon cycle ecosystem services into a whole variety of different environmental management frameworks. So in conclusion from this chapter, where do we see coastal carbon sequestration? We see it in salt marsh restoration projects in the West Coast and the Northeast. I've just discussed with you this concept of carbon of convenience, that we're regarding ecosystem carbon storage as something that can be used whenever it's needed. And there's ongoing development of this guidance through the Council on Environmental Quality process. And I hope, and I have been in contact with many of the people within NOAA, for example, who are working on this, so that this information can be used to directly inform future guidance within the system. Okay, so the last story I want to tell you is about the nitrogen cycle, not the carbon cycle. And in this case, we're talking about the nitrogen cycle at what I call the science policy interface. And so here, we're going to be shifting gears and talking about biophysical scientific approaches to understanding this social ecological system. And the social ecological system we're working in. Oh, yeah. I didn't take that out. The response of San Francisco Bay Delta phytoplankton communities to experimental ammonium nitrate and wastewater effluent additions under different light conditions is the title of this chapter in this paper. So ammonium nitrate, what are we talking about here? We're talking about San Francisco Bay, and we're actually talking about some of the problems that exist in the ecosystem of the bay. So there's this problem of low productivity. And that's led to something called pelagic organism decline. So ever since the mid-1980s, in the northern reaches of San Francisco Bay, there's been a sharp decline in chlorophyll concentration and in phytoplankton populations. And this is cascaded up the food web. So if there's not as many phytoplankton, there are not as many copepods and mysid shrimp. If there are not as many copepods and mysid shrimp, there are not as many fish species, including the endangered delta smelt. This is the largest estuary on the west coast of North America. And there's this puzzle. What happened? Why is it so unproductive? Especially because it has really high concentrations of dissolved inorganic nitrogen from agriculture and from wastewater. Both ammonium and nitrate are really high, and yet, contrary to the problems you might associate with excess nutrient loading, like in the Gulf of Mexico, which has a dead zone because of all the nutrients coming down the Mississippi from farming, we see a problem here of too little productivity, right? And there have been 4 hypotheses that have been put forward. One is that perhaps counterintuitively, ammonium, which is NH4 plus in a reduced form, inhibits or suppresses the uptake of nitrate, and that leads to less overall growth through the argument that phytoplankton taking up nitrate will actually grow more quickly and in more abundance and actually be able to bloom, and phytoplankton growing on ammonium won't. So that's one of the hypotheses that's been put forward. And the reason why we would think that ammonia would actually inhibit nitrate uptake is that it's already in a reduced chemical state. So think if you've ever taken a course where you learned about redox chemistry, this is oxidized and this is reduced. And so phytoplankton don't have to go through this extra step of reducing the nitrate. So it's advantageous to them energetically to just take up ammonium. The next is a similar hypothesis. It's that ammonium isn't so much inhibiting nitrate uptake as it's changing the phytoplankton community. And so that having high concentrations of ammonium from wastewater coming in down the Sacramento River is leading to a shift in the phytoplankton community away from highly productive diatom species that are the base of the food web historically towards other smaller celled species like cyanobacteria and cryptophytes. Now, there are other hypotheses. One is that the reason that there aren't as many phytoplankton is that the entire bay was invaded by the overbite clam, Potamicormula amurensis, in the 1980s. And this clam is a really, really impressive filter feeder, and it is preventing blooms from forming by engaging in really active consumption. And fourth, it's a really turbid estuary. There's light limitation of phytoplankton production. So there was a wastewater treatment plant that came online in the Sacramento River in the late 1970s, and the clam invaded in the 1980s. So both of these have a temporal component, but counterintuitively, light limitation is actually going down in San Francisco Bay. There's actually the euphotic depth has been going down over time because of lower amounts of sediment delivery. So the question that I'm investigating here is, what is the effect of ammonium from wastewater effluent on phytoplankton ecology in the San Francisco Bay Delta? So I'm really trying to take on both of these top 2 questions. Now, this is an interesting question ecologically, right? You have this kind of bizarre puzzle. We have high levels of ammonium and nitrate and low productivity. What's going on? To what extent could it be explained by some of these phenomena? But it's also a really, really important question from a management and governance perspective. So under the Clean Water Act being implemented by state agencies under the most recent NIPD's permit, the Sacramento Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant was required to go through an upgrade to install a nitrification, denitrification system and remove the ammonium pollution. That costs a lot of money, almost $2 billion total, right? And this was entirely built around the idea that there's this potential for ammonium discharge from the wastewater treatment plant to be causing all of these ecological problems. So we need to do something about it, even though the science and the jury on that science was still out. And secondly, and more recently, there's actually a group funded by agricultural interests that is suing the wastewater treatment plant, the sanitation district, over the release of ammonia. Why? Because it's endangering the delta smelt, according to them. Remember the sort of cascading up the food web that I described before, less phytoplankton, fewer copepods, fewer delta smelt. That's what is the basis of the lawsuit. So if we go back to our original theoretical framework, here what we're talking about are the dynamics of the resource system and their relationship to rules to control water quality impairment and pollution discharge. And in the previous two chapters that I talked to you about, I was really interested in understanding the middle ground here, right? And in assessing the action situation of an environmental impact statement. Well, here, what I'm doing is trying to understand strictly the resource system in order to inform this part of the social ecological system. And I mean that quite literally. So this fall, I will be going to the Central Valley Regional Water Board and presenting the science directly to the water quality managers. And that's the science I'm about to tell you about. Sound good? Okay. So just to orient you, many of you probably know where San Francisco Bay is. But what we're talking about up here is the lower Sacramento River, which flows from the city of Sacramento downstream and enters the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta right here. This is Suisun Bay and San Pablo Bay. And this whole system is an estuary here. And if we take a look at the ammonium concentrations in the lower river, this purple dot is that major source, 15 tons of ammonium per day coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. And there's actually data here. There's no ammonium upstream from the wastewater treatment plant and very high concentrations from 50 to 100 micromolar ammonium downstream from the wastewater treatment plant. So these were 4 cruises that we conducted with a new high spatial frequency ammonium sampling system. And this actually presents a wonderful situation to conduct an experimental analysis, right? You have no ammonium up here and a lot of ammonium up here. So let's take a look at the phytoplankton and how they respond in each of these with water collected here and water collected here. So that's what we did just about a year ago from 2 stations upstream from the wastewater treatment plant and 1 station downstream from the wastewater treatment plant. So we're gonna see a whole lot of results that look at Station A, Station B, which are both upstream, and then Station C, which has the really high concentration of ammonium. So here's our sampling design. In each case, we had water that we added nothing to. And then in order to understand whether there was any difference between us adding laboratory-grade clean ammonium and how the in-situ river water and phytoplankton were responding to the ammonium coming directly out of the effluent pipe, we added clean ammonium. So we're thinking this treatment should look the same as this. We also added filtered effluent. The reason we did that is that maybe there's something else coming out of this poop pipe besides ammonium that is negatively affecting phytoplankton cells. So let's do the crap control here. And then the third was adding nitrate. So we're trying to understand and compare the relative uptake rates of ammonium and nitrate and this idea that in high levels of ammonium, you're suppressing nitrate uptake. So here we can see, well, if we add the same amount of nitrate that also, there's a little bit of nitrate that comes from the wastewater treatment plant, we can directly compare the response of phytoplankton to growing on these 2 different forms of dissolved inorganic nitrogen. And we did this all in triplicate, like good experimental scientists. And we did it at 2 different light levels. Remember, light was one of the potential causes of affecting phytoplankton growth. So we incubated all of these different treatments at a high light, which was about 52% of irradiance, and a low light level, which is about 6% of irradiance. And just to give you a sense of how much suspended particulate matter and how turbid this is, 50% of the light is gone at about 60 centimeters down in a 10-meter well-mixed water column. And 95% of the light is gone before you get to 4 meters down. So this is kind of more like what the water column looks like. And this is a well-mixed water column in which phytoplankton cells are going up and down like this. So just keep that in mind when we start talking about the results. So one of the joyous things that you get to do during a PhD is to rent a 56-foot houseboat and drive it around the delta, which is pretty great. To rent a houseboat, you actually only need a valid driver's license and no other training. Thank you, Matt. I very nearly crashed it. And so every 12 hours, over 48 hours, we measured chlorophyll A production, the accumulation of particulate organic carbon, the uptake rates of ammonium and nitrate using a 15N stable isotope tracer method, and then also looked at the phytoplankton community at the beginning and end of the experiment, again with all of these different treatments. And so what did we find? Well, this is chlorophyll accumulation under the highlight treatment. These are all the upstream sites in red and green, and then the downstream site in blue. And this is at T0 and T48. So what we found is when you add effluent or add ammonium, or even if you add nitrate or effluent or ammonium or nitrate, or even if you just take the water out of the river and hold it at high light and don't do anything to it, you get an average 11-fold increase in chlorophyll concentration. But if you do this at low light levels, you do get growth, but you get much less. And so these phytoplankton in each of these treatments are starting to bloom. In this one, they ran out of nutrients because, remember, this is the upstream site that has almost no ammonium or nitrate. Now, we also looked at the accumulation of organic carbon over time. So this is the delta organic carbon, comparing the end to the beginning. And we see very significant accumulation of organic carbon in all of the different treatments. Not much difference between the treatments, but if you're supplying them with sufficient nutrients and light, they're going to grow. So all you have to do in order to get phytoplankton growth from the river downstream from the effluent plant is give them some more light. Because if you give them less light, so remember that first one was equivalent to holding them at 60 centimeters depth. This is equivalent to holding them at 4 meters depth. There's a lot less carbon accumulation. We also measured the uptake rates of ammonium and nitrate. And here's where we were testing whether we actually saw the suppression of nitrate uptake by ammonium. So here we get uptake rates of ammonium in all treatments. But in every single one of the treatments where we added ammonium, so either from the effluent or the direct ammonium addition, we had absolute suppression of nitrate uptake. But in the treatments where we added nitrate, or where there was no ammonium to begin with, but we didn't add any nitrate, we saw nitrate uptake. In other words, we confirmed part of the hypothesis, right? Ammonium is suppressing nitrate uptake, but the cells do just fine if you give them enough light. Now, the other part of this hypothesis was, does it change the phytoplankton community, right? Is there a shift away from diatoms if you add ammonium to these cells? And over 48 hours, what we saw was plenty of growth from diatoms. So diatoms started out at about 50 to 60% of the total cell count density in each one of our samples, and they ended up at between 60 and 90% of the entire community. Diatoms grew really well. In fact, they grew more rapidly than any other taxa. So the answer is, in conclusion, that light is a strong control on phytoplankton growth in this system. But more importantly than this, when we think about all of the decisions that are being made, implementing the Clean Water Act, around water management in this system overall that has a potential to affect the freshwater delivery and therefore the turbidity within the system, I think it's important for us to recognize that getting rid of the ammonium and converting it to nitrate and denitrifying it, in other words, stopping this source of pollution is not going to be a panacea for the woes of this ecosystem. And that's the science that we sought out to do and executed. So taking us back to the overall project of my dissertation, I've talked about knowledge to action in the Anthropocene. I've talked about understanding biogeochemical cycles and how we are trying to build institutions to manage them. What can we take away from this entire project? Well, I want to leave you with these thoughts. We're writing the rules right now, and careful attention reveals potential issues that have both theoretical and practical implications for decision making. And these details, while they might seem to be technical, have really strong personal, social, and political implications. There are a lot of dollar signs associated with the different assumptions that we can make. And so if we're trying to build an understanding of managing environmental problems into the Anthropocene, we need to recognize the interactions, as sustainability scientists, the interactions between our science and the existing governance frameworks and social ecological system contexts in which these decisions are made. Sustainability science means doing science within this context, and I think it's more fun that way. So with that, I'll take your questions. Anybody? Yeah, Jesse.
How do you reconcile the idea that like water is getting more, the turbidity is going down, but you're also getting decreases in diet on, like you're getting less productivity when you're saying light is important?
Right. So the results from my experiment couldn't test grazing because we didn't have clams in these bottles, and I really think that clam grazing is a major overall control on bloom formation. I think what was really striking from our results in the lower river was all the indicators we had were that our 5% or 6% light treatment actually was more light than the average cell was getting in situ in the environment. So when we looked at carbon to chlorophyll ratios or chlorophyll per cell ratios, those all moved in a direction that said even when we gave them 5% of irradiance, that was more light than they were getting there. So one answer is to say it may be getting lighter, and it's certainly in the South Bay, that's a major concern for the potential for eutrophication, but there's still a lot of light limitation of phytoplankton production. And the other is to say that clams may well exert a really strong control. The biggest and most important conclusion for the decision-making side of things is that ammonium cannot be blamed for the lack of phytoplankton production. Yeah, Casey.
Thinking about blue carbon, how are either local coastal conservation organizations or federal government who's developing these top-down rules thinking about uncertainty over the magnitude of the sinks and how that uncertainty might be dynamic and interact with other management decisions that take place over the life of the project?
They're really struggling with it. So within the context of the actual protocols, there's a whole set of caveats and rules that have been developed. This is the voluntary market protocol for how to estimate the flux from different ecosystem types. And one of the rules of thumb you'll see is that no projects can take place if salinity is less than 20, because without the sulfate from seawater, you can get methanogenesis and actually end up producing a lot more CH4 from freshwater coastal wetlands. Without the sulfate reducers coming in the redox cascade. So there are things like that, but I think it actually your question gets at something far more fundamental, which is that it costs a tremendous amount to go through all of the exercises to get this number exactly right. And in the end, you actually don't get it right unless you're out there measuring all these gas fluxes, and nobody wants to do that. So you have to discount and discount and discount, which eats into any monetary benefit. And so the recommendation that I have is you find the things where they're win-wins and you know that it's moving in the right direction, even if you can't actually pinpoint the magnitude of this. And instead of using an offset-based structure, and that's what concerns me about this sort of, like that Oregon EIS that had the numbers in it and said, well, we don't have to worry about this, is that if we move to a system where we actually have incentives or requirements for certain kinds of actions that you know are a net greenhouse gas positive, you don't have to worry about getting the exact number right every single time. But that's not the direction that our governance system is going. Yeah, David. He's a future E-IPER student starting in the fall. Thanks for coming to the fence.
So my question is, so you talked about blue carbon as an incentive for coastal conservation in the U.S. I was wondering if that also has been explored in the project.
Yeah, it's a fun. I mean, most of the action on blue carbon right now is not in marshes in the U.S. It's all in mangroves under threat from shrimp farming and seagrass meadows in the tropics, absolutely. And so Conservation International is leading a big push on doing all of that work at the international scale. I think that's where you're actually in a situation where instead of trying to restore an already lost or degraded ecosystem, you're in a position where you're trying to avoid the destruction of a system. So it's an ecosystem. And so it's a very different stage to be at in the consideration of the importance of this ecosystem service. But yeah, absolutely. That's where most of the action is. Yeah, Dan.
So this is a question. If you could just reflect on, through your PhD, you've been accidentally involved in the actual action side of sort of knowledge to action, whether it's the regional board or the work you did with Danny and the Air Resources Board. So I was just, if you could talk a little bit about how those experiences informed your science and vice versa. Just broad reflection. That was really great, by the way.
Thanks. Thanks, Dan. It's really wonderful if you go home for the holidays and they're like, so what are you doing your PhD on? And you're like, well, I've been spending my time actually going and talking to regulators about the decision they're making and trying to make them do it better. And I know a lot of people with a scientific background, when they start doing that, get really frustrated, because they often think, hey, we have the scientific answer, so you should do that. For me, it has just made my work far more meaningful to be able to engage in those processes that are ongoing. But it's hard. It's hard to study things that are taking place now, right? That aren't retrospective, and where, I went into this. When I first talked to the folks at NOAA back in 2013, they're like, yeah, no one is including blue carbon in any environmental impact statements. We're going to try to move in that direction in the future. I was like, well, actually, I'm going to take a deep dive into that. So it's tough to study things that are going on, but it makes the work far more meaningful and relevant.
Last question.
Yeah, Dan.
Just a quick one. I wondered if you could reflect briefly. All of your work touched on actual legal and policy and regulatory systems. How did you learn about that? Did you need to take classes on that? How did that shape the way you did your science?
Well, having 2 lawyers on my committee is a good first start.
How could other people?
They could put lawyers on their committee. No, so I did take classes at the law school and focused on the legal components of my education to learn the ropes of that system. For me, that was always something that I wanted to do and knew that I wanted to do. I think it's really wonderful that E-IPER has a joint master's degree program with the law school and has had many PhD students, or at least a handful, yourself included, that have done a joint JD and PhD. I thought about it, but you dissuaded me not to. No. Thank you. Do you want to? Okay. Do you want to say a word, Meg, or should I? Okay. So I have a lot of people to thank, almost all of whom, but many of whom are not in this room, for all of the wonderful support that you've given me over the 5 years that I've been here. And I just want to run through a few acknowledgments. I don't have the time or space to mention every single person, but this has just been an absolutely wonderful experience for me. And so first of all, I really can't thank my advisors, Meg and Kevin and my committee enough for being so supportive of this wild escapade that I wanted to engage with, for letting me go crazy with teaching, or at least not getting too mad at me when I did, and for just providing the insight and advice that has allowed all of this work to happen. And in particular, the Arrigo lab has just been an absolute amazing home for me, and every single one of you I cherish near and dear. And the culture in the lab and what Kevin, how you lead it is just, it's what I want to take with me into the future. And I've just been so inspired by everyone within the Arrigo lab. And Chris, in your lab has just been an amazing whirlwind of ecology and climate policy, and your role on the IPCC has just informed so many amazing discussions that have driven how I think about the world, and you have been a model for all of this, and everyone in the field lab has just been absolutely incredible. So thank you all for your support. Nicole's social ecology group, has just been this third. So I go to 3 lab meetings every week, or try to. And all of you, those in E-IPER and those in education and elsewhere, have been absolutely tremendously supportive of my work on this realm. And I'm really excited that Carly, who couldn't be here today, is a postdoc working with Nicole and will be also joining the faculty at the University of Maine in wildlife policy starting in the fall. There are 3 policy hires in marine policy, wildlife policy, and forest policy, and 2 of them are coming directly from the social ecology group. And the 4th home that I've had has been the Center for Ocean Solutions. And Meg, you have brought me into the fold and introduced me to all of these wonderful people with whom I taught classes with whom I wrote papers that had nothing to do with my dissertation with, and with whom I've continued those relationships. So thank you, and we miss you at COS, excited for the future of COS, but thanks to all of these people. The incredible team from the EVP project from EFML and Stephen's group and Chris Francis's group has just been so wonderful to work with, Ivy and Julian and Bradley in the field. And then this project in San Francisco Bay just got wrapped in with amazing, amazing folks, Monet Berg and Jim Klern and Rafe Kudela, who know so much about this system, were so willing to just open their labs, provide resources, provide all this equipment. And similarly, Nona and Todd, in supporting the work that I didn't talk about today at the Global Change Experiment at Jasper Ridge, were just tremendous scientific colleagues to work with. So thanks to all of you. And none of this would have been possible without my 2 research assistants in different summers, Tara and Anna. They're both have done so much hard work on 2 different projects. And actually, Anna's shown here. She was actually my research assistant on the blue carbon and environmental impact statements. She slogged through so many environmental impact statements, but she also came out on one of the cruises out to San Francisco Bay, which was really neat to work with her. And they're both going to be co-authors are co-authors on the papers coming out of this. Thanks to all of my funding sources. This isn't possible without that. Both the SIGIF and SGF have been immense, but also the EVP grant from the Woods Institute. It's just been incredible. And I do have to thank the teaching teams that I worked with. So none of those classes that Kevin showed, not a single one was taught by myself. Every one of them was co-taught with at least one other person. It's been an absolute pleasure to go to Alaska twice with Rob, with this amazing team, Zach, Lita, and Lauren the first time, and with Elsa the second time, getting to inspire so many of these students to understand and think about the challenges of sustainability and socio-ecological systems. And many of our students are actually going back to Alaska this summer to continue internships there. Getting a chance to go to the climate conference in Paris and bring 30 students to Paris to attend a UN meeting was just an incredible, incredible experience. Richard and Neil and Sarah were incredible, and I know many of those students are in this room, so thank you all for coming and being the amazing students that you are. I'm happy to write letters of recommendation whenever you need them, and have been. Thanks to Sarah and Nicola for being incredible co-instructors for the course on open space management and the course on environmental governance. Just such a pleasure to work with both of you. And thanks to the whole E-IPER community. This is just people in the years plus or minus 2 years, more or less. But everyone, this is just an incredible home. It's an incredible home for doing the kind of work that we do, and having that community, without that community, none of this would be possible. And similarly, all of the colleagues who are not E-IPER students, but are people that I've worked with closely throughout my dissertation, are just absolutely wonderful. So thank you to all of you. Jen and Deb, I know Deb's not here, but you are absolutely just, I have no idea how I would do any of this without you. So thank you for everything that you do. And that goes for everybody. Ben and Anjana and Sue and Helen, you make this crazy ship move. And Peter, I hope you wear a tuxedo every day. And finally, thanks to my wonderful wife and son who just woke up. You're my rock and my pebble, and I need both of you. And I'm excited to say that we're welcoming a daughter this summer. So. Thank you.